Alrighty, I'll go ahead and get us started. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the California State Library's Government Publications and Information Services section and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife for a very special program about California's extraordinary biodiversity and important efforts to help conserve it. My name is Jenna Pontius, and I'm the host of tonight's event. I'm an information officer in the communications section of the California State Library. We have two co-hosts tonight, Mona Robinson, who is a supervising librarian in our government publications section, and Whitney Albright, who is an environmental scientist with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's Science Institute. Whitney and Mona will be monitoring our Q&A section throughout the talk for any questions you may have for the speakers, and we will read your questions during our Q&A session at the end of the presentation. The California State Library is thrilled to partner with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to bring you this new series. This lecture represents the first in a 4-part series of conservation-themed lectures that will be offered throughout the year, so stay tuned for future lecture announcements. Before we begin, I just have a bit of housekeeping to go over. There we go. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A section, and we will answer them at the end of the program during our Q&A session. This presentation will be recorded and made available after the program. And the live transcription is enabled, so if you'd like to see captions, click the CC icon to show subtitles. If you run into any technical difficulties during the presentation, please put those in the Q&A section, and we will try and help you if we can. We're also adding links related to the California State Library and California Department of Fish and Wildlife in the chat window. For any state employees without a library card, please consider applying for one through the posted online application link. So please enter your questions or any technical issues you may have during the program into the Q&A section. Before we get into our speakers for the evening, we do have some special guests who are going to kick off the main event. We have Valerie Termini, Chief Deputy Director of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the Deputy State Librarian, Rebecca Wendt. Valerie, you have the floor.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks so much for being here and taking time out of your evening on a rainy evening here in Northern California anyway, to join and learn more about biodiversity and biodiversity conservation in California. We're thrilled that you're here. We're also super excited to be partnering with the California State Library. I don't think that we've done this before, so this is a great new partnership. Through this partnership, we've had the opportunity to promote and support ecological literacy of all Californians. The Atlas, if you don't have your hard copy, let us know. The Atlas of Biodiversity of California, as you'll hear more about, is a beautiful and special depiction of California's biodiversity and what's at risk of being lost without coordinated efforts by all to conserve our biodiversity. 30 by 30 is one of our most important conservation initiatives of our time. It's intended to tackle major threats like climate change for the persistence of nature and the places and species that we value. We hope you enjoy learning more about these topics today, and thank you for showing up and caring about California's fish, wildlife, and plants. Thanks so much, everyone.
And this is Rebecca Wendt, your Deputy State Librarian, and I want to echo Valerie's remarks about how excited we are to be having this partnership. And this is one of 4. As she noted, we'll be talking a little bit about the Atlas of the Biodiversity of California. And as your state library and with our wonderful government publications section, we have copies of the book. We're cataloging things so that they're available to anyone who needs to or would like to see it. It's highly recommended. As a state library, we support state agencies in their information needs, as well as making sure that all of the government publications, such as the Atlas and other reports that come out, are available for anyone to access. So this partnership is fantastic. I'm looking forward to the following 3 programs as well. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Rebecca and Valerie. So I'm going to introduce our speakers for the evening. They are Ryan Hill and Megan Hertel. Ryan Hill is a research data specialist with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, CDFW. Ryan has a master's degree in landscape ecology from UC Davis. As a part of a small team called the Conservation Analysis Unit within the Biogeographic Data Branch, Ryan spends his time sorting and sifting through data about California's wildlife, vegetation communities, and the numerous factors which paint the broader picture within which we can begin to understand how wildlife and vegetation thrive, adapt, and are impacted by human activities and natural processes. Our second speaker is Megan Hertel. Megan Hertel joined the California Natural Resources Agency in February of 2024. Ooh, happy one-year anniversary. And she is the Deputy Secretary of Biodiversity and Habitat. In this role, Megan leads the agency's efforts to conserve biodiversity and improve habitat across the state through the implementation of California's 30 by 30 strategy and associated efforts, including the Cutting Green Tape initiative and supporting the implementation of large-scale habitat projects. Before joining the agency, Megan served as North American Director for Land Life, a technology-driven nature restoration company, and spent over a decade with the Audubon, I always pronounce this incorrectly, California, holding several positions, including Director of Land and Water Conservation, where she led statewide conservation for programs focused on inland water and working land strategy. Please join me in welcoming Ryan and Megan. And Ryan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jenna. And let me share my screen here. Hopefully you can all see that. And thanks to all of you who have tuned in this evening. Really appreciate you taking a little bit of time out of your day to be with us. My name is Ryan Hill, and it is a genuine privilege to have been invited here to speak on a topic that is very important to me, biodiversity. At the Department of Fish and Wildlife, our mission, our mandate, every task that we engage in is linked back to biodiversity. We strive to understand it, to manage and steward it responsibly, and to encourage others to do the same so that ultimately we may protect the legacy of California's natural heritage that we have all inherited. To accomplish our mission, the Department of Fish and Wildlife has hundreds of staff across the state, as well as numerous outside partners collecting and sharing data on all manner of life forms. From the smallest creatures that live in our freshwater streams, providing food for our trout, salmon, and other fishes, to the towering giants that preside over entire histories, watching over those streams as they ebb and flow, and even change course through the years. To all of those organisms in between, big and small, ephemeral and ancient, here for just a few days, or like us, for only a handful of years. Our department staff and researchers across the state are out there asking questions about each of these organisms. Our vegetation staff are mapping where plant species are found. Our wildlife staff are mapping and monitoring elk, bighorn sheep, burrowing owls, and yellow-legged frogs, to name only a few. And our fisheries staff are out there asking questions that are, well, they are very fishy questions, to be perfectly honest, but they are vitally important for understanding the condition of our native fish stocks and for the maintenance of California's substantial recreational and commercial fisheries. And while each of these teams across the state are answering their own species and regionally specific questions, in the Biogeographic Data Branch, or BDB, where I work, we bring much of that data together and then zoom out to ask more general questions, such as, where on the landscape are species most plentiful? Where are they most diverse or most imperiled? And as these larger patterns begin to emerge, we can then explore the spatial relationships between these patterns in biodiversity and what we know about the soil and the climate, hydrology and topography, all of these factors which come together to make biodiversity in California one of the most incredible displays of life anywhere on Earth. And so today, we'd like to share some of what we know with you. And we're doing this through the Atlas of the Biodiversity of California, 2nd edition. The Atlas is 124 glossy pages of full-color maps, photos, and written accounts of the state's diverse wildlife species and habitats. The limited run paperback edition has been distributed to libraries across the state, and a digital version of the Atlas is publicly available online. And I do believe somebody is going to drop a link to the Atlas in the chat. So here are a few of the facts which highlight the exceptional nature of California's biodiversity. Within the United States, California is ranked #1 for the greatest number of species. We're also at the top of the list for the greatest number of endemic species, such as the giant kangaroo rat, which you see here. These are species that are found within the state of California and nowhere else in the world. This profusion of plants and animals is a result of the great diversity in the California landscape itself. And here's a wonderful infographic from the Atlas. And if I can bring your attention to the inset map of California at the top left, it shows a line which divides California roughly in half. That line begins in the San Francisco Bay Area in the west, crosses through the Central Valley and the Sierra Nevada mountains to arrive into Death Valley to the south and the east. And if you were to travel along that line between those 2 points, you would actually be traveling along that roller coaster of topography, which you see below, accompanied here by some photographs which provide a little insight into what the landscape looks like at any one of these peaks and valleys in the terrain. So within a mere 80 miles as the crow flies, you can find the snow-capped peak of Mount Whitney, which is the highest point in the contiguous United States, as well as the scorching sands of Badwater Death Valley at 282 feet below sea level. And both of these places are less than 200 miles from the Pacific Ocean. And both places are also host to unique forms of life, specially adapted to their local conditions. California's diversity of soils, topographies, geologic histories, climates and microclimates, as well as ocean currents and bathymetry, which is the contour of the terrain beneath the water. These factors come together in California's mountains, grasslands, and deserts, flanked by 840 miles of coastline to give rise to one of the richest locations for life, not only in the United States, but in the entire world. So I'd like to pause for just a moment now to give you just a second to reflect on this quote. I'm not really sure who said it first. There's kind of a legend that says that a wise old uncle named Ben once spoke it to his nephew, a kid by the name of Peter Parker. And he said, "Peter, with great biodiversity comes great responsibility." Whoever actually spoke these words is really not the point, because the meaning is clear and true. California has the highest human population of any US state, and where people build and farm and lay ribbons of asphalt to move from one built-up place to the next, habitats become fragmented and changed. Plants and animals are confronted with these changes. California ranks second after Hawaii in the number of imperiled at-risk species. The California Department of Fish and Wildlife is charged with the great responsibility of ensuring that this heritage remains a living legacy. The department's mission is to manage California's diverse fish, wildlife, and plant resources and the habitats upon which they depend for their ecological values and for their use and enjoyment by the public. This statement is bold and ambitious because California covers nearly 100 million acres of land, hosting a variety of ecosystems. It has an extensive coastline rich in marine life, not to mention the incredibly complex relationship between land and sea. We have the Sacramento Delta with its ebb and flow and mixing of fresh and salt waters, and the rivers and streams where salmon and steelhead reproduce in the cold snowmelt and then journey to the ocean to feed and mature before returning again upstream to their cold birth waters. To manage California's diverse fish, wildlife, and plant resources and the habitats upon which they depend is an awesome responsibility. So what I'd like to do now is give you a brief peek into the contents of the atlas. But before we even crack the front cover, I'd like to draw your attention to the incredible artwork which invites you to explore the pages that follow. Dugald Sturmer is a master illustrator who graciously donated use of a number of his works for the first edition of the Atlas more than 20 years ago, and his family has honored that spirit by granting us permissions for the second edition. Mr. Sturmer's art graces our book cover, and each chapter opens with one of his interpretations of California's plants and animals. And while the atlas is beautiful to look at, it is also informative. Much of the species and habitat data was aggregated and summarized in the Biogeographic Data Branch, BDB, where I work. But I want to stress that the work that we do in BDB is only possible because of the hard work of all of our CDFW colleagues and outside partners across the state who strap on their boots every morning and they get out there in the dirt and the weeds and the kelp and the marshes and the mud flats and the high mountain meadows and the valley and desert floors, despite all the ticks and the poison oak and the rattlesnakes and everything else that comes with the job. And they collect the data that we need to understand what biodiversity looks like in every part of this state. Chapter 1 of the Atlas begins with a definition of biodiversity. And I've already been using this word biodiversity for probably close to 10 minutes now, simply referring to it in general superlative terms like the extraordinary richness of life. And this is absolutely what biodiversity is. But as scientists, we like to be more precise with our language, and we can do this by looking at biodiversity as a hierarchy at different levels of organization. At the basal level, we have genetic information. And the more variation we have among these genes, the greater the diversity that we'll see expressed in the organisms where these genes manifest themselves. These organisms interact together as populations, and most And then these population groups of different species will interact with one another in what we call natural communities. And as we zoom out, we can see multiple communities forming together into ecosystems and biomes. And we have staff here at the Department of Fish and Wildlife who are interested in the health and status of biodiversity at each of these levels. Now, I've briefly touched upon some of the remarkable attributes of the California landscape, which are largely responsible for giving rise to California's incredible display of biodiversity. And chapter 2 of the Atlas elaborates on this remarkable geography. There are sections on climate, topography, ocean currents and temperatures, bathymetry, geology, soils, and vegetation patterns. And each section of the Atlas is accompanied by stunning maps which can be found throughout the Atlas. These maps were created in BDB by our own cartographers, masterfully blending data with artistry to create works which not only inform, but inspire. Chapter 3, Measures of Biodiversity, is filled with examples of the kind of work that we do day to day in the Biogeographic Data Branch to reveal patterns of biodiversity across the landscape. There are a number of maps such as this one, which tell the story of how a particular taxa is distributed across the state. This map is showing amphibian richness, and richness is a term that simply means the number of different species in a particular location. And this map is showing increasing numbers of amphibians along this color gradient, with fewer amphibians in the lighter browns, moving to dark greens where we find the greatest numbers. And we can see with this map, not surprisingly, that the highest number of amphibians, which are frogs, toads, newts, and salamanders, they're found along the coast, where temperatures tend to be cooler in these areas which are heavily influenced by the ocean conditions, where moisture levels are high and there's abundant fog and rainfall. We see more moderate amphibian richness through the mountains, which are also generally cool and moist, but the mountains also experience greater temperature extremes than is typical on the coast. And this is likely one of the reasons we see fewer amphibians here. Frogs apparently not big fans of the snow, though there are a few documented occurrences of highly unusual individuals. There's always exceptions to the rule. And of course, there are our desert areas, too dry for most amphibian species, and the Central Valley, largely converted for agricultural uses. Both of these areas have very low amphibian richness. Not surprisingly, we see the story for reptiles is almost the opposite of that for amphibians. Here we see reptiles, snakes, lizards, and tortoise, concentrated in areas that are hot and dry, mostly towards the south and the east, where our deserts are. But I'd like to zoom in for just a moment on the inset map here, which is telling another story about reptile richness, this time rare reptile richness. And rare in this context has a very specific meaning. It's all reptiles which have a special legal status, such as threatened or endangered, or a department designation, one of which we call species of special concern. And these labels are intended to draw attention to the imperiled condition of these species and to muster resources for deliberate management actions to safeguard their survival. The stories of rare reptile richness and overall reptile richness, they're similar, but they're not the same. Rare reptile concentrations, represented here in the deepest shades of green, are shown in what is essentially the large, sprawling metropolitan area of San Diego. So a natural question is, why is it that so many rare reptiles are attracted to the big city? And the truth, of course, is that these species have been here for a long time. They were in these areas when there were few, if any, people around at all. And as we change the habitat to fit our cultural needs, we have driven these species into the realm of rarity. Much of their habitat has been lost, fragmented into habitat islands, separated by highways, houses, and orchards. And maps such as these help us to understand the implications of our actions upon biodiversity. And understanding can help us to make better decisions moving forward. Chapter 4 of the Atlas provides additional examples of California's unique biodiversity. The Atlas provides a very accessible introduction to a few of the vegetation communities, such as coast redwoods, which form distinctive habitats that support a wide array of species. It highlights a few of the elusive and enigmatic species who make these forests their home, such as the marbled murrelet, illustrated here, a bird that is federally listed as threatened and state listed as endangered. Marbled murrelets feed in the coastal waters, but then nest in the tops of coast redwood trees. This written account tells us that only 5% of the largest old-growth coastal redwoods remain today. Only 5%. This, frankly, is a legacy of unsustainable development, a legacy of assumptions that the priorities of past generations would align with the priorities of today. With the reduction in coast redwood habitat, we have also seen the decline of many species which rely upon it. The principal factor implicated in the continuing decline of marbled murrelet populations is the loss of suitable habitat. The California Biodiversity Initiative, unveiled in 2018, and the 30 by 30 project, launched by Governor Newsom 2 years later, which lays out the explicit goal of conserving 30% of California's lands and coastal waters by 2030. And I know that Megan Hurdle is going to tell you more about these initiatives shortly. These efforts give me hope that those old assumptions, those old ways of engaging with the landscape, are being replaced by a new vision for California. Actually, I want to correct that. I want to take a step back because it's really not a new vision for California, but a way of thinking about our relationship with the natural world that is in fact much, much older. It's important to remember that California was occupied and stewarded responsibly by people for thousands of years before Europeans ever set foot on these shores. These voices are still here, and I am grateful that many of us are really beginning to listen. There are a number of additional habitat types featured in the atlas, including vernal pools, kelp forests, deserts, oak woodlands, and grasslands. Chapter 4, Examples of Biodiversity, also profiles several animal groups, such as anadromous fishes. They have a remarkable life cycle in which young are born in the freshwater and then spend anywhere from a few weeks to several years there before migrating to the ocean to mature. They then return to the same stream in which they were born to give rise to the next generation. This map provides an overview of the watersheds, which contain rivers and streams used by different anadromous fishes. The darker the watershed, the greater the number, some watersheds hosting as many as 11 distinct species. And lastly, I want to present these final two sections of the atlas more or less together because they really do go hand in hand. If we want to effectively conserve biodiversity, we need to know what we're up against. We have to understand what the threats are, where they are, how they're forecast to develop over time, and how they're likely to impact biodiversity. We want to know where our efforts and investments will have the greatest impacts in light of the multitude of threats. So how much progress have we made so far? The principal map above is showing us protected and what we're calling semi-protected working lands. The most protected core areas are shown in the darkest green, and the areas to the south and the east. The inset map, on the other hand, is showing that the highest concentrations of biodiversity are along the western coast. There's certainly some overlap here, but overall, these maps are almost opposites of one another. Protections seemed concentrated in the east, while biodiversity is concentrated in the west. Now, I really want to put a finer point on this because this map seems to imply that the desert is not a biodiverse place, and that is simply not the case. The desert may not have as many species as other areas of the state, but the harsh conditions of the desert have set organisms there on very unique evolutionary trajectories, making these species and habitats particularly worthy of our attention. So the take-home message I really want to leave you with is that these two maps do not tell the full story of how well California's biodiversity is being protected. But they're a start, and they should really get us thinking. As we add protected areas to the state, how well are each type of California's plants, animals, and natural communities represented within those protected areas? These are questions that we are working to answer. We do have deserts pretty well represented in our portfolio of conserved areas. We also have a variety of other habitat types under various levels of protection, and Chapter 6 shares a number of these success stories. And as a celebration of these successes, and much of the work that the department has done over the years and continues to do today, we give you the Atlas of the Biodiversity of California, 2nd edition. And we've packed quite a bit between its beautifully illustrated front and back covers. And we offer you this atlas to accompany you on your own personal journey exploring California's natural heritage. We believe that when you have a better understanding of what is out there, where it is, and how it all works together, we will all be in a better position to conserve it together. The Atlas makes a wonderful teaching tool with its accessible introductions on various topics. You can use it for high school assignments or read it to your younger kids at bedtime. Because who really needs stories about enchanted forests when there are very real kelp forests more unworldly than anything that could be dreamt up or written into fairy tales? And I thank all of you so much for your time and tuning in and for your attention. And I am now going to pass the baton over to Megan Hurdle to tell you more about what she and her team have been working on to conserve all of what I've just been talking about.
Ryan, thank you so much for that beautiful presentation. I have to say you are not only a scientist, but a poet and maybe a part-time comedian. I think I saw a few jokes snuck in there. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise and the incredible work that you and the team at California Department of Fish and Wildlife is doing. I also just want to point out that that was an amazing advertisement for careers that you can have in natural resources at places like California Department of Fish and Wildlife, where you can go out and actually work on the landscape to help preserve some of the places that make California unique and special. So I had the pleasure today of coming and following up that incredible presentation to talk a little bit about California's 30 by 30 initiative. And Ryan set it up really well. Our 30 by 30 initiative is the effort to conserve 30% of our lands and coastal waters by 2030 to reverse the catastrophic biodiversity loss that Ryan talked a little bit about. That's not just happening here, but is happening worldwide. So to get us started, Ryan, you did such a lovely job talking about the biodiversity that we have in California. And you also talked about the fact that we're losing that biodiversity. So California is known as one of the globe's 36 global biodiversity hotspots. That means we have more biodiversity than any state in the United States. And many of the species that we have here are only found here in California. Those are endemic species. But because of the threats that you talked about, these biodiversity, these species, these plants, even the biodiversity that exists underground in soil is disappearing. And it was many years ago that we started to see coverage in national news, in articles, the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, about this loss of biodiversity, the sixth major extinction that we're experiencing. And we began to see scientists, not just in the US, but worldwide, call for action. And this is really where the 30 by 30 initiative and target came from. Many international scientists came together, they studied the catastrophic loss of biodiversity and realized that we needed some sort of common commitment by which to begin to conserve, protect, and restore these special places that support the plants, animals, and people that rely on the ecosystems of the world. So 30 by 30 became a rallying cry around the world. And I'm proud to say that California was one of the first places to step up and commit to this ambitious target. So this is a picture here of Governor Newsom in 2020 executing an executive order that committed the state of California to reaching this goal by 2030. Now, I want to point out that this executive order also included targets for climate. We call them nature-based climate solutions. And so that is saying that the state of California will set forth a series of targets on how we can use our landscape to help mitigate for climate, so absorb carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, as well as help us adapt to climate change. So be prepared for things like that we need to provide more equal access for all Californians to these incredible places. I was thinking as Ryan went through his presentation, how much I wanted to get out and visit all the beautiful landscapes that he highlighted. And this executive order by Governor Newsom calls for us to do that. But it wasn't just here in California. While we were the first ones to commit to 30 by 30, the United States followed shortly after with the America the Beautiful Pledge. And then 2 years later, over 190 countries signed on and committed to the 30 by 30 pledge through the United Nations COP, or Conference on Parties. This picture here is actually from Cali, Colombia this past fall, where California went and joined over 190 countries to talk about this commitment to 30 by 30. And I point this out just because I wanted everyone here to know that while 30 by 30 is very much about protecting the species and plants and animals we have in California or that travel through California as part of their migration, we are also part of a worldwide movement to do this. And what we do here matters. It matters on a world stage, not just in our backyard. So now we have the executive order from Governor Newsom. The first thing we did is we went on a public process to think about how do we achieve 30 by 30 in California. We spent 18 months hearing from the public, scientists, NGOs, advocates, and more about how we should go about conserving 30% of our land and coastal water. This included regional meetings, tribal consultations, over 70 of them. We also included an online survey where we got thousands of responses of what people wanted to see protected and conserved in California. And we formed topical advisory committees to dig into some of the more challenging topics where we knew we needed to bring in expertise to understand how to do this right. And I'm proud to say in 2022, we released the Pathways to 30 by 30 strategy. Now, I know earlier on some links were dropped in the chat. After my talk, I'm happy to redrop them in, but you can go online and find this Pathways document, which really lays out how we plan to achieve 30 by 30 in California. And really, there are three components or objectives of this. The first is obviously to protect and conserve biodiversity. This is the primary piece of 30 by 30. The second piece of it is to expand access to nature. And we do this for many reasons. One, we know that access to nature is critical for human health and well-being. Two, people that have access to nature are more likely to understand it, to relate to it, and want to protect it into the future. Now, our last objective under this is really to make sure that we are contributing to our climate mitigation and resilience efforts as we conserve biodiversity in California. So these are our three overarching objectives as part of this plan. We also have core commitments that we set forth that we heard loud and clear from all of the people that participated. The first commitment is that this needed to be something that benefited all Californians, that we needed to go about this work as equitably and inclusively as possible so that all Californians could see the benefits of it. The second is that this should be done in partnership with tribes. As Ryan mentioned, we've had many tribal and indigenous communities that have lived in California since time immemorial, stewarding this land. They have traditional ecological knowledge on how to care for this land, and they need to be partners at the table as we move this forward. And our third core commitment was that we need to do this in a way that ensures that California continues to be economically prosperous, that it's a place where people can live and thrive in addition to all the plants and animals. Now, from this document, there were 10 strategies that came out. I'm not going to go through each of the strategies right now. You can pull up the document and look at it, but there's a very, very diverse way that we plan to protect biodiversity in California. There's also a definition, right? This is a quantitative counting goal. What counts for 30 by 30? It's usually the first question that people ask me. Well, here is the definition that we came up with after the public process. So lands counting for 30 by 30, two key pieces here. One, they must be durably conserved. That means they must be protected for as long as possible. So things like conservation easements, owned and operated by the government as an open space biodiversity area, under tribal stewardship permanently, legal protections that will keep it in open space and natural. Conservation easements on rangelands, another great example of what durably protected would be. The second piece of the definition is that these lands must be managed for biodiversity. So these must be areas where the land manager or the land owner has some sort of plan or intent and effort to maintain and help the biodiversity that occurs on that land thrive. So where were we? Where did we start? In 2022, when we released our Pathways to 30 by 30, we were at roughly 24% of lands conserved and 16% of coastal waters. Well, I'm very pleased to announce that as of September 2024, we are now at 25.2% of our lands conserved and 16.2% of our coastal waters. And in just this last year, we counted an additional roughly 861,000 acres of land that count to 30 by 30. Now, this is made up of land that is newly purchased to be managed for open space and for habitat, lands that have new conservation easements, lands that are being returned to tribes who are going to steward that land for biodiversity and conservation. It also includes lands that have greater levels of protection that maybe weren't durably conserved before, but have been moved into some stronger state or federal protection. And it also includes some data fixes, where as we go through over 100 million acres of land, we are continually looking for ways to improve our data, find lands that should count for 30 by 30, but also identify ones that should not. So let's talk about a few of the successes we saw in this last year. It's been a turbulent first month and a half of this year, and I think we could all use a moment to reflect on some of the wins that we had in the past year. And this first one I'm incredibly proud of. So last year, California granted roughly $100 million to indigenous tribes throughout California to return roughly 40,000 acres of ancestral land. This picture is from the Hoopa tribe. They purchased back roughly 10,000 acres of their ancestral land. And as you can see, the forest there has actually been cut and damaged, and they will be working to restore that land going forward and to manage it for biodiversity. So such an incredible win, and really gets to that second core commitment of partnering with our Indigenous communities. Another one we had here is up called the Tahoe Gateway Project. And this one is a project by the 40 Acre Conservation League, which is California's first Black-led conservation organization. This is 650 acres of land that they purchased that they are going to manage for fire resilience and protection. So going in and making sure that local communities and infrastructure is protected as the forest is managed for biodiversity and for wildfire resilience. They're also going to be managing this property to sequester more carbon to help us reach our climate goals. And they're going to be providing much needed equitable access. So incredibly excited about this project. On the ocean side, the Ocean Protection Council, which is the one that leads our 30 by 30 effort in the coastal waters, released a new decision-making framework for how we can look at our coastal waters, which are in public trust, to determine what should and what should not count for 30 by 30. And in this next year, we expect additional announcements on land, on coastal waters, that will count to this important goal. Now, some big wins that we had across the state, we saw several actions on national monuments. These are designations on federal lands that will permanently protect these areas. These efforts were led by tribal partners throughout the state. They often involve public access and important species on these areas. So the picture you see here on the screen is San Gabriel National Monument expansion in Southern California. We also had the Snow Mountain Berryessa National Monument expansion, which is right outside of Winters, California. And then the two most recent national monument designations, you have Chuckwalla National Monument, which is just south of Joshua Tree, and Ryan, near some of those beautiful desert pictures that you showed us. And also Satitla National Monument, which is up by Shasta. Many people refer to this area as Medicine Lake, and this is an incredible place that holds roughly 20% of the Sacramento River water that is filtering through here. So incredibly important, not just to tribes, but for the water supply for much of the state. So excited to see these areas conserved. And now on naming those, there were countless others that protected special species, restored habitat, that provided public access while keeping these places for biodiversity. And of course, we're addressing climate mitigation and resilience, all of these goals we have under 30 by 30. So what do we have left to do? We've got 5 years to go, and we have roughly 4.8 million more acres on land that we need to conserve to that definition that I talked about earlier. And we have roughly 500,000 acres of coastal waters that need to be durably conserved and managed for biodiversity to reach this objective of 30 by 30. I did want to just take a moment and note that the state has many different priorities that intersect and complement our 30 by 30 initiative. While 30 by 30 is very much focused on biodiversity, we also have a state priority that's called Outdoors for All that is very much focused on creating the spaces and providing the access for all Californians to get outside. We have California's Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan and Task Force that is thinking about how do we manage our forested land to ensure wildfire protection, forest health, and much more. And of course, we've got some of the most ambitious climate objectives, including a goal of net zero by 2045. And we have a set of plans and priorities that lay out exactly how we will get there. I did want to highlight a couple of the resources that are online for folks who really love to dig deep into maps and explore data. Data transparency is very important to us as part of the 30 by 30 effort. And so you can go online on our CA Nature website, which we'll put that in the chat, and actually look at what lands are currently counting for conserved under 30 by 30 and where we have gaps. And so this is just a screenshot of the whole state, but you can actually go in and zoom in and explore parcel by parcel to understand what areas are protected and which are not. You can even zoom down to a county level. I'm located in Sacramento, so I actually went ahead and put up Sacramento County on here. And as you can see in Sacramento County, we have less than 1% counting for conserved. Now, I recently had a conversation with the city of Sacramento, and there's several areas that should be counting that are not showing up. So this number will be changed soon. But this is a really great way that you can actually go to your region or to your county and understand what areas right now are being durably conserved and managed for biodiversity. So what can you do? There's many ways that you can get engaged in the 30 by 30 effort and help us achieve our ambitious goals here. The first one is to share the story. And that's why I was so excited to be able to come on this webinar and presentation tonight. We need more people to talk about 30 by 30, to understand what it is and why it's important, and to really know that by protecting and conserving biodiversity, we are protecting our own health, we're helping our communities for wildfire resilience and be prepared for climate change and so much more. So we need your help getting the word out about 30 by 30. The second thing is, if you love to look at data, please feel free to go to our website, zoom in, look at your area, check to see what areas near you are counting for 30 by 30 and which are not. And there's two angles here. One, if you see something that should be counting that is not currently showing up in our data set, I would encourage you to reach out to us. Let us know so that we can make sure we have the accurate data. Now, this is important because we want to make sure that we are protecting the broad diversity of habitat types that we've got in California. And Ryan really pointed out many of those. But if we don't know what is already conserved, then it's very hard for us to identify where there are those gaps, right? And it's hard for us to think about, okay, we need to do more investment in these specific habitats or areas for certain species. We're also spending a lot of time thinking about how these different areas are connected through corridors and other ways that will allow for species movement, either up and down in elevation or across the landscape. It's very important that we have accurately mapped our conserved areas so we can begin to look at those linkages between the places that we're protecting. You can join us to learn more about all the work we're doing by signing up for our monthly newsletter. We both send information about 30 by 30 as well as events across the state where you can get out in your community and do restorations or cleanups or volunteer activities. And finally, think about biodiversity in your backyard. Much of what Ryan and I have talked about is some of these beautiful sweeping landscapes that make California very iconic. But there is biodiversity in urban areas in your backyard as well. And so I would encourage you to think about planting native plants, your water use, all the ways that you can help support pollinators and other wildlife within the city. This is a picture of our Instagram page. We also have a Twitter page. Please, if you are on either of those social media sites and want to learn more, take a moment to join us. Our handle is @30by30CA. So you can join on Instagram or Twitter in addition to the newsletter to get real-time updates on how things are going. And then lastly, this is just a flyer. You can scan the QR code that is on there. It will take you to our website. But this digs a little bit deeper about how you can provide some of that biodiversity in your own backyard. So I would just like to wrap up by saying it is going to take all of us working together to reach this 30 by 30 goal and to ensure that California continues to have the biodiversity that has made it famous. And at the center of all of this biodiversity is us as people. We are part of these ecosystems. We are part of the biodiversity, and we cannot separate ourselves from it. That's why it's paramount that we all work together to make sure that we have this biodiversity going forward. So I know we're going to have a few minutes for some Q&A on here, so I will just wrap up and invite Ryan to come back on the screen with me. And just once again, say thank you to everybody who joined this webinar for taking time on this evening to listen to a little bit about the work that we're doing.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Ryan, for that inspiring and engaging talk by both of you. So we are going to transition to a time for questions. So if you haven't done so already, you now can type your question into the Q&A. And Mona, do we have questions coming in?
Thanks, you guys. That was so inspiring and such a great talk. And yes, we have a lot of questions coming in. There's several different types of questions, some questions related to the atlas itself and its availability that I believe Ryan's going to answer. And we have posted the link for the digital version of that, but I know people want their hands to get on the copy of the physical book, and it does exist. So we'll be asking Ryan a bit more about that in a little bit. But I think the first question that we will go to is, let's see. Okay, the first one. The most acres of new lands added to the 30 by 30 inventory have been the national monument designations. How can California continue this progress and protect itself from attacks on the NMs, the national monuments?
Thank you for that question. That is a really good question. So the federal administration did roll back the America the Beautiful initiative, which is the federal 30 by 30 effort. We here in California are still committed to 30 by 30, not just because of Governor Newsom's executive order, but also because it was later passed into law through a bill. I do want to just, before I jump to the national monument piece, just say that 30 by 30 is not a regulatory mechanism. So it is not something by which we go out to private landowners or others and require that everybody conserve 30% of their land. This is very much a voluntary grassroots-led effort for people to opt in and identify areas that need to be conserved and then work with the landowners to conserve them. And national monuments are a great example of that. Our tribal partners have led those national monument efforts. They were designated under the Antiquities Act by the Biden, Chapala, and Sissetlagorn. And right now they are under a 15-day review by the federal government, along with all other national monuments in our country, to determine which ones the federal government would like to make different decisions with. So there is an effort being led by many of the tribes and advocacy groups that work to establish these monuments, including businesses, veterans, outdoor recreationists who worked very hard for many years to get these special areas protected, to reach out to federal decision makers to let them know that they wanted these national monuments protected, that these are very much community efforts and that these lands are sensitive and deserve to be protected. So I would say, the state of California will be working closely with our federal partners to give them the information to show why these places should still be protected. I would encourage everyone on this phone to reach out to your elected officials or to engage in advocacy if this is something that matters to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yeah, I can tell that there's some questions about the point that you made about private land and volunteer and concerns that people can take the land or you can force the land. So I thank you for clearing that up and explaining that about the initiative. Okay, we have another great question. Interested to hear about how the 30 by 30 tackles integrated pest management. Invasive species are a huge threat to biodiversity and require upkeep. It's not enough to save the land from development. It's a great question.
It's a great question. And Ryan, I'm hoping you'll tag team this one with me. Maybe I can kick it off and then you can add some thoughts on the role of pest management when we think about biodiversity and really how to steward these lands. So from a 30 by 30 perspective, it includes all different sorts of land that's owned by private landowners and managed by private landowners, land that's owned by the federal or state government, by local land trusts, by cities, by counties. What we're looking at is it durably conserved and is it managed for biodiversity? And I would say on the managed for biodiversity, there is a wide range of things that people do on properties to try to promote the native habitat and also control invasive plants or species that are harming it. So maybe I can pass to Ryan. Do you want to add in at all on this? It's there's not one shoe fits all just because there's so many different habitats. So it's a little bit of a challenging question to answer.
Yeah, I mean, I know we have various folks throughout the state who are working to eradicate invasive species. I work on a project called Areas of Conservation Emphasis, where we aggregate a lot of data. And one of the categories is various stressors. So we have maps about sea level rise. And one of the maps we have is sort of the degree of invasiveness, like how impacted have different areas been by different invasive species. So it lets folks get a sense of where is this problem the worst, and depending on what is available in order to acquire for new protected areas, or, it's part of the strategies. Some places may be so invaded that you just say, you know what, low priority. We're going to handle these places that we can actually get a handle on and restore to some level where we can really redeem the ecological function. So it really depends on what your ultimate goals are and what's happening at different site-specific areas. But, it's something that's on our radar for sure.
For sure, and there's a lot of research and funding that is going into this effort, and I know it depends is a challenging, non-satisfying answer, but when you have such an incredible swath of biodiversity, there's not one size fits all type of answer.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that answer, those answers, and clearing that up. Okay, we have a couple that are related to wildfire. And so I'm going to group them a little bit. Let's see. First of all, I wanted to say people are really enjoying the program and wanting to share it with their grandkids. And there's definitely going to be a recording available. And we're really proud of you. Somebody says they're very proud of their state. So that makes us really happy to hear. And, you know, we're really thrilled that you guys are joined with us and attending tonight. So there's a couple questions. The first actually is about, they're interested to hear about how you feel about prescribed burns as it relates to conservation. And it kind of dovetails on another question about forest fires in general, but I'll start with this one. The recent California fires were immensely destructive. And one of the reasons I've seen being identified for their intensity is the lack of enough prescribed burns to get rid of fuels that feed the fires. And I know this is a complicated, deep question, but it's a good one. So if you guys wouldn't mind answering that, that would be great.
Yeah, Ryan, I'm happy to start, and then you may have things to add in. So yes, we do need to return beneficial fire to the landscape. And one of the things that the state of California did when it first arrived here and set up government was it actually outlawed beneficial fire and cultural burning that our indigenous partners and communities have done for thousands of years. And what we're now coming to realize is that by outlawing that traditional practice, we have allowed many of the areas of the state of California, particularly in forests, to overgrow and get too thick. That we should have learned from the indigenous folks that were here in the beginning and learned and allowed that practice to continue. So we are trying to fix that and now create more opportunities to do beneficial fire or prescribed burns. I do just want to comment on the Southern California fires. They are incredibly heartbreaking. I did have an opportunity to go down there and tour the Palisades fire several weeks ago. And our focus is on the recovery and rebuilding for those people, the communities, and the places that have been harmed. But what we're seeing with these extreme fire events is that, yes, we do need to make sure we're managing open spaces and vegetation, particularly around communities. But with the high wind event that we saw there, the buildings themselves also were heavily contributing to the spread of fire. So California has been and is continuing to update building standards so that the buildings themselves are also not becoming part of the fuel as we see more and more of these climate-driven extreme events. California in the last several years has invested $3 billion in roughly 2,000 projects that include beneficial fire, forest thinning, fuel breaks, and other wildfire resilience work. You can actually go online and find out where all of these projects are located. There's 2 different dashboards. If you go to the CAL FIRE website, you can actually find a dashboard that is a fuel treatment dashboard. And then there's also one that is a wildfire resilience project tracker. Both of those would allow you to go and see throughout the state, not just where California has been doing wildfire resilience projects, but also our local partners and our federal partners as well. Do we need to do more? Certainly. Do we need to reintroduce beneficial fire and allow our indigenous partners also to do more cultural fire? For sure. Well, we will also need to address the built environment as we face more extreme weather with climate change. Ryan, would you like to add to that from a biodiversity or science perspective?
I don't have much to add other than the fact that much of California evolved with fire. Like, fire is not only something that might help us, but it's necessary. There are a number of species of plants that don't sprout properly until they are exposed to a certain temperature, certain amount of heat. So bringing fire back to certain areas is certainly important to reduce those fuel loads that we have suppressed over quite a number of years. But and you hit the nail on the head when you said we really have to think about our building codes, how we build and where we build, because we all love to live out there in nature, and nature was meant to burn. So we have to really think hard about that.
Thank you. Thank you for those answers, because it's an interesting question. It's a paradox. It seems like it wouldn't be the case, but I'm curious, what you said, Ryan, was interesting about some species that actually are activated by fire, or they are encouraged to grow. And it kind of speaks to this another question that came in. To what extent has wildfire destroyed endemic species in California? But on the other hand, in what way has it encouraged some of these endemic species? That's too tough? Is that a big one?
I mean, it's a great question. I don't have, again, a simple answer. I'm a data guy. I'm kind of a generalist. So, but
That's okay.
when we're talking about endemic species populations, these are species that only occur in California. They're often very limited in terms of their range, so they're not widespread. So they are particularly susceptible to catastrophic events of any sort. Any major disturbance could have a huge impact on the number of genes in the population. It could really knock them back severely. So that's one thing to think about. When it comes to plants, a lot of them are pretty resilient, though, especially these fire adapted ones. You've got seed banks that can sit there for a number of years, and they often really surprise us after then we have a huge water event, huge rainfall, and we see things come back. But I don't have any specific examples because I'm really not educated enough in terms of the specificities of vegetation.
I can give an example of a fire.
Great.
Just
awesome.
for I feel like my former Audubon colleagues would be very disappointed if I didn't name a bird that is dependent on post-burn landscapes. So the black-backed woodpecker, which its name is very descriptive, requires post-burn landscapes as part of its life cycle. And so this is just one example of a species that has adapted in California to a regular regime of fire. And so by suppressing fire for almost 200 years in California, that species has seen pretty significant decline. There's also quite a few really incredible wildflowers, and I would encourage folks to go to Save Mount Diablo's website if you haven't. They've done some long-term studies of wildfire plants post-fire within the Diablo range, and there's some really incredible resources that you can look up about some of these fire plants that only come out immediately after a fire. I think the challenge is, as we start to see the fire return interval be much, much higher, and also the intensity of the fires, like Ryan was saying, be much higher under climate change, even those fire adapted species can be harmed.
Great. Thank you for those examples. That was awesome. Yeah, it's fascinating. Okay, so we have lots of more questions, and I'm trying to group them. One more question along the wildfire line. It says, don't invasive species, grasses, for example, increase wildfires also, not just doing prescribed burns for undergrowth, and climate change is making them worse, like the high winds for recent LA County fires. So you did sort of answer that already, but so when they're talking about invasive species, I think they're wondering if they're beneficial in some way.
Ryan, I feel like we should say it depends all the time. So I'd like to make the distinction, maybe actually, Ryan, could you make the distinction between non-native species and invasive species? Because I think that there is
That'd be awesome, yeah.
So we have native species, which we expect to be here, which have been here for many years, centuries. We have non-native species, which are not naturally occurring here. They've been brought here, but they don't take off like wildfire. They don't spread aggressively. And so we have things that we consider invasive species. And some of these come in, in the horticultural trade, the pet trade in various ways. And once they get out there into the landscape, they just, wow, they don't have competitors or predators. available because they didn't evolve here, and they just take off like wildfire and spread much faster than they can be controlled. So that's the difference between an invasive and a non-native. A non-native didn't come from here, but once it's here, it's just like, I'm just kind of happy to sit here and do my thing.
Yep, and some of those invasives are fire prone. So an example would be arundo. This is a very tall reed-like plant that you'll often see associated with like water ditches or water areas. At one point we were planting it because we thought that it created bank stability, but it turns out it does not, and it is also very fire prone. So there are non-native invasive species that do increase the risk of fire.
Okay, great. Great. And there's another question that's interesting too. It just asks on this point a little further. It would be great to specifically target under conserved vegetation types such as blue oak woodlands. Can CNRA develop plans to direct conservation more specifically?
Great question. So if you go to our CA Nature website, there's actually a tool on there where you can go and you can look at the variety of habitat types in California and at what level they're conserved. Brian showed some really great maps also that think about habitat types that are conserved. You are right, blue oak woodland is one of the ones that is less conserved, I would say, or less protected in California than some of the others. We do have conservation plans and priorities based on species and habitat type. There are quite a few of them. Whether it is an endangered species, those often have recovery plans. So I would say they exist out there. And we are going to be releasing our next annual report in fall of this year. And we do expect to spend a little bit more time talking about what we would see as opportunities for additional investment in these areas. Ryan, what would you add? Because I know you've looked at a lot of the different conservation priorities and reports that are out there.
Yeah, so right, our goal is to conserve 30% of lands and waters. But the question is, what is contained within those 30%, right? What is well represented and what are we missing? I'm also part of the Conservation Biology Network, which is a great big group of really smart people that includes academics from universities and lots of NGOs. And right now we're putting together kind of a rapid assessment of what do we feel is really well represented and what are the targets that we should really be thinking about in terms of making sure that we try to prioritize. So there are efforts underway to really focus on that question.
That's right, Ryan. And CBN, as we like to call them in shorthand, California Biodiversity Network, also has opportunities for folks to get engaged. There's roundtable discussions on a variety of topics, including working lands, what other science needs to be done. It's a really great group.
Oh, that's great. Maybe we can get those links from you too and send them out when we send out the recording. I'm sure people, there's a lot of interest in your links, and we will be sending those out, like I said, with the recording, because there's so many more that you've mentioned just during the program. Okay, so we're going to move on to creatures. As an entomologist, I always feel that we really have not a good idea of the conservation status for a lot of species, except for a few showy ones like the monarch butterfly. What are the challenges of conserving insects?
You want me to start? Ryan, I was always that kid in class that fills the empty space.
Go for it.
You don't jump in. Please go ahead, I'll follow you.
No, we have a pollinator coordinator working at CDFW. She is one person. We have a lot of people interested in this issue, but considering the fact that we still have vertebrate species where we're lacking really accurate range maps and things that we're working on to fill those knowledge gaps, we need an army of staff and folks to cover all these gaps in terms of taxa and life forms that we don't know as much about that we really would like to.
Yeah, I would ask that to say, how incredible is it that we live in a time where we have learned so much and understand so much about the world, and yet so much of it remains a mystery. So to insects, I would add soil biodiversity as something that we're just beginning to understand the edges of how important that is. And you're right, Ryan, the government isn't staffed enough to do it all. And so we do rely on our academic partners, on non-government organizations that do independent research and can help elevate different species and build our breadth of knowledge. The other thing I would add is there is an app on your phone called iNaturalist. Ryan, have you used iNaturalist before?
Absolutely. In fact, CDFW has a partnership with iNaturalist to really integrate these data streams. It's really exciting.
It's a super cool app. For someone who doesn't know their insects, I will just tell you, so you can download this app on your phone, and then if you can go out and take a picture of the insect, presuming you can get it to hold still for long enough to at least get a blurry photo. And then iNaturalist can actually help you identify what insect that is. And then at the same time, that becomes a scientific data point that iNaturalist is collecting, that then people like at CDFW or academic institutions can actually download that data and begin to use it to help fill in some of the gaps that we've got. I did one out at FEA, local nature center we've got here, and it was just a blurry video of a bee, and it was actually able to identify it as a native bee and then log that result and citing within the broader database. So that's just one way local people can get involved in actually helping fill in some of the gaps of science that we've got.
That's great. And I think the citizen science projects that are out there, there's so many of them now. And it's so important. And I know people are liking, I've worked on those projects myself, and it's fun to be involved in something that actually makes a difference. And so I'm being told that the question that you just answered, you spoke to, actually kind of fits in with the microbial diversity question. We have a couple of those. And so Ryan, you mentioned the difficulty of not being able to catalog microbial biodiversity, which is a difficulty that IUCN species assessments also have. So what current conservation measures do we have at the state level to conserve macrofungal biodiversity and cataloging? Okay, that was a question I'm not even sure I understand, but I thought I'd put it out there because one of our viewers asked it, and I think it's interesting.
Soil biodiversity. I'm going to be honest. If there's probably somebody out there doing it, I don't know who they are. I'm not familiar with their work.
Right,
but I would love to hear from them if they're out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to get emails tomorrow from the people within government that are working directly on this. I think Mona, we're gonna have to pass on that question just because I don't think either of us have the direct information to give you on it.
Okay.
But it does just point to the direction that this is an area where we need to continue to grow our efforts, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And we've been talking about state symbols recently here at the State Library for 175th anniversary coming up. And I did not even realize that we have a state soil. So it's a good thing to start talking about. So thank you for that. I just wanted to say, as we've been going through, you've talked about citizen science and things, and we've had a couple questions about opportunities within the CDFW for graduate students. Or do you guys use graduate students, or is that something you have opportunities for volunteers within CDFW, or is this something that you recommend people go to other outside organizations?
No, absolutely. Come talk to us. Send us an email. We do work with graduate students. It depends on your interest. I mean, in the biogeographic data branch, we tend to work with folks that like to model and do kind of geeky, codey kind of things. But if you like to go out there and strap on your boots and go sloshing through the wilderness and checking traps, that's also something you can do. Internships, so there's all kinds of opportunities with CDFW. Just send a message to anybody and we will get it to the person that's most appropriate to answer that.
And I'll put another plug in for the 30 by 30 newsletter. We do monthly try to have a little segment at the bottom that talks about volunteer and engagement opportunities. So actually 2 plugs. One, if you have a volunteer and engagement opportunity that is relevant to 30 by 30 and appropriate for us to share, please send it. There's an email address on our website that you can send that to. And then on the flip side, if you're interested in getting engaged somewhere, that's a good place to look.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much for addressing that. I thought a lot of people have been interested. A lot of people have really enjoyed this program and your talk and your conversations about the 30 by 30. And we have a little bit more time, and I just wanted to circle back. I know you spoke a little bit about this. I have two questions about federal lands in California. And I apologize if you answered this, but are federal lands located in California included in the 30 by 30? Was that? They are. Okay.
Nuanced answer on that one. So the
Okay.
federal government owns and operates almost 50% of California, which I think catches a lot of people off guard. They don't
Absolutely.
realize just how much of our land in California is actually federal land. And so some of that land does count for 30 by 30, but not all of it, because it depends on whether or not it's durably protected and managed for biodiversity. So a great example is Bureau of Land Management that owns millions of acres in California. They have a multiple sort of mission, right? They're supposed to be providing recreation. Also, they're providing opportunities for mineral extraction or other energy development. And in areas, they're providing protection for biodiversity. So they have some land that is designated as wilderness area that has a higher level of protection and management for biodiversity. That does count for 30 by 30 because it's hard to reverse that. You would require an act of Congress to make something not a wilderness area. Now, BLM has other land that is not designated for that, where they can actually do drilling or other things like that. That land does not count. So a nuanced answer, but it really does depend. So some of the federal land does count and some does not. It depends on how it's protected and managed.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. We have a question, interesting question. We're moving to the coast. So we have a long ways to reach our goals of 30% of coastal waters. What measures are CNRA considering to advance coastal conservation?
Great, I'm glad this one got to be answered live because I know there's also some questions about marine protected areas in there. So the coastal water of 30 by 30 is all public trust water. So unlike on the land side where you've got private landowners and government owners and all different types of landowners, on the coast it's one ownership, right? But there are different designation in the coastal waters. So right now we have 16% that's counting for 30 by 30. That is made up of by our marine protected areas, which is our series of areas along the coast of California that were established to help conserve and rebound the ocean life that we've been seeing diminish for many, many years. Now, last year, the Ocean Protection Council released a draft decision-making framework, or basically a draft set of, okay, well, what other areas within the coastal water should count for 30 by 30? They did many months of public comment and are right now going through the process of looking at all that public comment to decide, okay, based on feedback, what things should count. Things that are on the table for consideration are obviously additional marine protected areas, as well as things like national marine sanctuaries or other areas that are managed for water quality or for the health of the biodiversity in there. So we are looking beyond MPAs to try to get to 30 by 30. That is a really important piece here. And I do expect for the feedback from that public process to be released in the coming months through the Ocean Protection Council.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks so much. And thanks for speaking to the coast. And so we're going to go inland a little bit to the desert. And so this is kind of a funny one. When talking about biodiversity in the desert, you included a picture of a Gila monster. Have there been recent credible sightings of Gila monsters in California?
That's a good question. I don't know offhand. I would have to check our California Natural Diversity Database, CNDDB. That's where that would certainly be recorded. I know our range tells us that we can expect to find them within the California boundaries. Whether or not one has been seen recently, I cannot tell you definitively.
Ryan, I also saw Kermit, I think, in your presentation. Would that also be in the database?
I have not seen Kermit personally. That was sent in to us by a researcher. So
okay, very good. We're
he's out
getting
there somewhere.
yeah, we're getting close to the end of our questioning in our program. I just wanted to, let's see. we have some thank yous. Thank you again for this presentation, your answers to these questions. People want to know once again about working for the CDFW. Love to hear about the opportunities with the etymology department. And so that's great to know too. And everybody was thankful for learning about iNaturalist. We have more macro fungal questions, so we could go on for quite a while. So if we don't get to your questions tonight, just, I can copy the questions and try to get some answers for you a little bit later. But I just wanted to say, let's see, there's a couple questions about like practical things everyday people can do for 30-30 in their backyard. So I'm wondering if you can, I know you've addressed some of those, but like if you zoom in to what a human can do, a Californian who cares, could do in their own backyard. I mean, I'm guessing planting natives, but maybe there's more, so if you have any suggestions, that would be awesome.
Absolutely. So the largest crop that's grown in the United States is a lawn. And so the first thing that we can do is replace that non-native grass that's incredibly water intensive with native plants. There's this really cool initiative by Doug Ptolemy. It's called Homegrown National Park. I think I got the name right on that one. If you Google that, it should pop up. And he really is advancing this idea of that we've worked so hard to preserve these incredible places like Yosemite and Yellowstone, which are important because of their ecological value and their grandeur, but that we could all have homegrown national parks in our backyard, even if you just start with simple things like replacing and putting in a few natives, thinking about what pollinator needs, leaving the leaves on your lawn, because that's actually when a lot of insects are cocooning in for winter and they need that cover. So there's a whole suite of recommendations from things that are very easy to things that take a little bit more effort and work, but I would encourage you to look that up. But it really does start with simple steps. And I would say, take the easy ones and, build upon that. You don't have to rip out your whole lawn on the first day, but you can certainly replace some of the non-native ornamental plants with native flowering plants that provide nectar and food for.
Yeah, and Megan, if I could just jump in and second what you said about iNaturalist, because it works on multiple levels, right? It's an educational tool. You can just go around, if you don't have the app yet, iNaturalist, download it, put it on your phone. You can go out there and just start learning the names of things. What are all these cool insects and plants that I'm seeing in the garden? It will help teach you that. But secondly, that data, you're collecting data, and that is actually going to come to us and can help inform what we understand about what is happening with biodiversity out there on the landscape. Especially if you're on, your own property, private lands where we can't go with our little team doing our surveys, but we rely on you to do it. So absolutely, iNaturalist is a fantastic way to get involved.
And Ryan, I saw someone asking if it was just insects. It's not. It's plants, fish, birds, all the types. And I think it even has an audio recorder, if I remember correctly.
I haven't used it for that.
iNaturalist did not pay us, by the way.
Brought to you by iNaturalist. No, I'm kidding. No, thank you. That's great. And I did see that, Megan, that you had wanted to answer a question about Prop 4. Did you want to address that real quick before we wrap up?
We should not make that the last question, so I'll try to keep this very short. Someone had asked in the chat, how will Proposition 4 help us meet 30 by 30? So Proposition 4, or as we call the climate bond, was passed by California voters in this past November. It's a $10 billion investment in the coming 5+ years in water, so making sure people have safe drinking water and that we're ready for drought, in wildfire preparedness, and in addressing climate change. So there will be some of that investment that goes to achieving 30 by 30, particularly the lands that can help contribute to drought, water supply, climate, and all of those pieces. So a big thank you to the voters of California. It's lean budget times, and to know that the people of California want to invest in safe drinking water and being ready for the next drought and wildfire is really incredible.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Okay, this will be our very last question. And it goes back to the atlas itself. And one of the viewers was asking about how that particular artist was chosen. And the illustrations are truly beautiful. We do have a copy here at the library, 2 copies. And they were wondering who got to choose the artist and how you guys chose that particular artist. And that'll wrap up. We'll end on a high note with the art.
Yeah, so the first edition of the Atlas was published in 2003, and I had no affiliation with the department at that time. But Dugald Sturmer has a son who works for the department, and I believe he's been with the department for quite some time. So it may be that connection that enabled us to establish that relationship with Mr. Sturmer Sr. and be able to use that amazing artwork.
It is really beautiful artwork.
It really
It's
is.
fantastic.
The otters, we love the otter. I mean, it's very beautiful. And
And
so
if I could just,
yeah,
if I could
yeah.
address really quick, because people, again, I don't want this to be the last question. It's a little bit of a downer because so many people go, how can I get a copy of the Atlas? And unfortunately, a hard paper copy is not available at this time. There was one printing run and all of those were distributed to libraries across California. So they're out there, but the way that you can access, everybody out there can access the Atlas at this point is through the digital representation.
Or you can come to the California State Library and look at one of
Or
our
go to the
copies.
library.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I did see some, I was looking up because I was like, I'm not sure of the answer. And they're out there. I mean, you can buy them used copies and things, but they're kind of pricey now because they're out of print. But come to the California State Library if you're in Sacramento and take a look. So thank you so much. And the last thing I just want to say is that people are excited about upcoming programs with CDFW. They were hoping for little previews of what might be coming up next. And I don't think we know that quite yet, but they're in the works. And we just really appreciate your time and all the work that the Natural Resources Agency does and the Department of Fish and Wildlife. The state library loves natural resources, the Parks Department, and we have a lot in common. We like to be good stewards. So thank you to you. And then I'm going to turn it back to Jenna. And thank you so much for providing this lovely program.
Thank you for the opportunity. This was a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
Indeed. Thank you. I second that.
I will continue with the thank yous. So I want to thank our special guests, Chief Deputy Director Valerie Termini and Deputy State Librarian Rebecca Wendt, and our presentation speakers, Ryan Hill and Megan Hertel, for their wonderful presentations. Also, thank you to Whitney and Mona for monitoring our Q&A. It was very active. And thank all of you for attending. We hope you've been inspired to explore California's amazing biodiversity. And like Mona said, we will share the recording of this presentation and the links in a follow-up email in the next few days. So thank you very much for attending and have a great evening.